Compared to India, Africa was a little bit slower to achieve their independence after World War II, and there were several factors that played a role in this. First off, much like India, a lot of the push for independence came from your Western educated elites who had been trained in either Western style schools in Africa or trained overseas and brought those Western ideas back with them. And that's going to help lead to growing resistance to European imperialism in Africa. But overall, they were just a little bit slower to get that independence. A lot of the groundwork for independence had already been laid in India during the interwar period. That didn't really happen in Africa until after World War II. Plus, many imperialist powers didn't feel Africa was ready for self-government. There were also some parts of Africa that had large numbers of European settlers that were against African independence. Also, the Cold War played a role. The fear that these independent nations could turn communist. You also had a lot of economic issues and political instability that are going to plague many parts of Africa even after gaining independence. And some of those issues continue all the way to present day. So when we look at the model for decolonization in Africa, there were two kind of main paths. And there was kind of a peaceful path, and that's represented by countries like Ghana. Ghana was one of the first nations to gain independence after World War II in 1957. And Kwame Nkrumah was a nationalist leader. Again, he had been educated in missionary schools in Africa as well as schools in the United States, and used what he learned to create the Convention People's Party. And the Convention People's Party helped organize boycotts and strikes to resist British rule in Ghana. And initially, Kwame Nkrumah was imprisoned. Later, he was released, though, and gradually Britain kind of relinquished control to first African legislative bodies and later grants full independence to Ghana in 1957. And so, for the most part, their process of independence came peacefully. There were several kind of uprisings and clashes, but overall, they gained their independence kind of gradually and peacefully. The area where we tended to see more violence were in these settler colonies. Because in colonies where large numbers of Europeans had actually come and settled, well, they didn't want Africa to be turned over to the African majority. And they refused to give up their lands that they had acquired. And so in those regions where nonviolent methods weren't working, that's where we tend to see the use of violence in order to achieve independence. So some examples of this. In Kenya, Kenya's independence is going to be led by Jomo Kenyatta. And at first, he tried to use nonviolent methods, but they simply weren't working. And he's going to form the Kenyan African Union to try to push for independence. But again, the nonviolent methods simply weren't having that big of an impact. So the Land Freedom Army was created, and they began to attack British and settlers and others who sympathized with British rule and use terror and guerrilla warfare to try to achieve their means. In fact, Kenyatta is going to be arrested as the violence kind of began to escalate. And ultimately, Britain steps in and uses brutal force to put down this violent rebellion. But after putting down this rebellion, Britain was finally ready to listen and negotiate with Kenyatta. And so Kenyatta is going to be released from prison, and he and other leaders are going to negotiate Kenya's independence. And so Kenya will gain their full independence in 1963, and Kenyatta is going to create a one-party system in Kenya. Despite the creation of this one-party system, Kenya actually became one of the more successful and more stable nations in Africa after gaining independence. Another example of violence in gaining independence was in the French-controlled Algeria. So in the late 50s and 1960s, France is going to grant independence to pretty much all of its African colonies except Algeria. And again, the problem with Algeria was there were about 2 million French settlers living there, and they considered that their home. And again, they didn't want to be part of an independent Algeria. They wanted to remain under French control. And so revolts are going to start to break out against French control in Algeria. The National Liberation Front is created. They're going to be one of the major groups that lead these revolts against French control. Meanwhile, the French settlers counter that with the creation of the Secret Army Organization. This was groups of French settlers who fought against the Arab and the Berbers and the people that wanted independence. And so this leads to this ongoing war in Algeria. 500,000 French soldiers are sent in to help kind of put down these uprisings, atrocities and massive casualties on both sides. But finally, France is able to kind of get things back under control, but then they grant independence after the conflict is put down.